Okay, next up, let's have a look at some exam guidelines. I want to show you some aspects that I've called exam guidance overview. These particular topics which I'll be bringing up is feedback from the examiners themselves, since they've been kind enough to share this. And I suspect these next 4 slides you'll want to come back to at the very end of your studying before you take the real exam. I was considering covering this at the very end, but I think knowing it up front before you study the actual topics we're going to cover will be most helpful to you. First up, a positive approach. The APM want new members and they actually want you to pass. So give them the evidence to show that you are worthy. It's very easy when you go into an exam and feeling nervous. That's quite natural. I always do. I'm sure you will. But be aware they're on your side. They're not there to trick you, to stop you from joining. They actually want you to pass. Now you'll find the exam questions typically ask you for 2 or 3 aspects of a particular topic. And for each point that the question asks for, number and separate each of them. For example, in a real question, you may have part A, part B and part C. Don't just run your answers into one endless stream. Good exam practice, as always, is make each point or sentence or paragraph and then leave a space, a blank line, before writing the next piece. But when it comes to answering part A or B or C, clearly show the examiner which is A and which is B and which is C. Read the candidate notes from the APM website. I'll be pointing you to where you can find those later. You need to allow 15 minutes for each question. And it's important to start each question on a new page. Get used to doing that with your pad of paper. Number each question, and indeed each part question, as I've already mentioned. And use good time management and time box answers. Now you may have wondered why I said 15 minutes for each question. Well, this comes down to good time management. Since you've got to read all the questions at the start of the exam and decide which questions you're going to answer and which ones you will leave, you may even want to give each question a simple scoring system, such as marks out of 10, to see which topics you feel most confident about. However, you'll need to leave time for reading those questions and making your choice, and at the end of the exam, it would be a good thing to have a few minutes left over to go back and check and make sure that you've answered all of the questions correctly. So allowing 15 minutes for each question is a good strategy. If you find yourself spending 20 minutes on an early question, it's highly likely that you'll run out of time and you will not be able to complete the last question that you answer. Write on one side of the page only, as well as starting each question on a new page. Don't write on the back. Leave extra space at the end, as it may be possible to add more information later when you go back and review any questions. What you had forgotten or couldn't think of when answering the question may come to you, and it's nice just to have some space where you can quickly scribble in some extra points. Those may make all the difference between a pass and a fail. Skim read each question and note questions you feel confident about. As I've said, consider using a simple marks out of 10 to quickly prioritise which questions you should answer. Now what's coming up next is fairly obvious, but please make a note. Avoid alcohol. Certainly the night before. The old adage of go to bed early and get up early is a good one here. Arrive early. Plan your trip to arrive at least 15 to 30 minutes before the exam starts. There's an advantage here, is that you can select, therefore, a good seat. I remember when I took my exam, it was during summer, and sitting by the window, the sun was streaming through, but because I'd turned up early, I managed to sit in the shade. Of course, also arriving early, it allows you to mentally prepare. Grab a cup of coffee or tea or whatever, or a glass of water, and you're ready to start. When it comes to answering your questions, make brief points. The examiner is usually looking for a simple, straightforward answer, even if you have to make several points. Use bullets wherever appropriate. The examiner is very happy if you use bullets, and it'll often mean that you don't have to write so much supporting text around each part of your answer. Do not write essay-style answers, as these tend to take a longer time to make similar points, with the risk of your hand, wrists, elbows and arms becoming tired before the end of the exam. Do read each question and note exactly what is being asked. I expect, much like me, you had the same advice back at school, and it's equally true as adults. I'm afraid it's the nature of us humans that we read a question and very often we read into it what we'd like to answer rather than saying exactly what is being asked. I'll give you some more advice on that in a moment. If medically acceptable, do bring energy drinks with you into the exam. You'll know the brand names I'm thinking of, but because they often have high levels of caffeine, please don't use them if you have an aversion to that or any medical condition that would mean that's a dangerous thing. But if they are something which you take from time to time and you're quite comfortable with, I really do recommend them, as you need to keep energy high throughout the exam. Continuing with our exam guidance overview. Some questions have the words explain, and when you see this, it means the examiner requires a detailed explanation of the topic in question. You should expect to write a paragraph consisting of 2 to 5 sentences for each explain aspect, perhaps including a relevant example of the point being made, if that helps prove to the examiner that you have understood that aspect of the syllabus. You will see a question type called list and describe. What the examiner is looking for here is that they want you to make a list heading followed by a paragraph of description. The list element is worth 2 marks and the description is usually worth 8 marks. So in other words, make it clear, here's the list heading I've got and here's my description. If the list element isn't clear or missing, then a maximum of 8 marks only are awarded, just for your description. You can expect to write 2 or 3 sentences to describe the listed heading. You can see now why I'm giving you this information in the first module, because as you start to practice some of the part questions in my exercises, you can start using this discipline so that when it comes to the exam, you're not going to make mistakes. Another type is where the question asks state, in which case all this requires is a single sentence to summarize the point being made. Here I'll give you an example. State 4 benefits of using a product breakdown structure. So benefit 1, benefit 2, benefit 3. I've just given you here benefit 1. A product breakdown structure, and by the way, in the exam, at least once make sure that the examiner knows that this stands for a product breakdown structure. Helps to define the scope of the project. If a product is mentioned, it is within scope. If it isn't mentioned, then it would be out of scope. So in a very simple sentence here, notice I'm using a semicolon here, as it's a nice way of answering a question fairly quickly. Another exam type of question is where the examiner uses the word determine. This is a new type and will not be used on any exams before the 1st of May 2015. And this refers to a calculation type question. And therefore, a determine question will only be used for either a critical path type question, where you need to calculate the critical path or some aspects of it, or earned value management. Now, a determine type question will be used in conjunction with list and describe, state and or explain. But if you're taking the exam before the 1st of May, you will not come across any determine style questions. I just want to make a few points about the terms advantages, disadvantages and benefits. It's very important to understand this exam question terminology, as many delegates confuse them in the actual exam. So for example, if a question asks you to state 5 advantages of a particular topic, what they're after is a positive perspective or an outcome or an understanding. Please be aware that an advantage is different to a benefit. Continuing, a disadvantage is seeking a negative perspective, outcome or an understanding of a particular aspect. And benefits, these are the positive aspects of having something, and you should not be answering the question by giving an interpretation of what the absence of a benefit may mean. In other words, if we didn't have this benefit, we couldn't do whatever. So make sure the word benefits is captured in a positive light. Now, you may think these 3 points are fairly straightforward and fairly obvious, but believe me, in an exam, feedback from the examiner is that certain candidates are misinterpreting this and losing a large amount of marks. Number 3, when a question asks about the benefits of a process, do not respond with the steps of the process. In other words, don't describe you do this, then you do that. It's what the benefits are. In all of my video modules that you'll be watching, I make it quite clear in the heading what the benefits are, or an advantage or a disadvantage. So you'll have plenty of choices to draw from when answering such a question. Where the question seeks benefits of a role, or benefits of a process, or benefits of a technique, the candidates need to focus upon the benefits, the upside if you like, the positives, not what would happen if that role was not present. Again, you may think that's a fairly obvious thing, but in the heat of the exam, some candidates are answering that wrongly, as described here. Displaying lists. You can, as I've mentioned previously, miss up to 2 marks per list item if you don't display them. You can do it either as a distinct list of the beginning of the page of your answer, or as a keyword or phrase at the start of a paragraph, as an initial statement, usually with a full stop. Displaying a list can be an underlined keyword or phrase at the start of the paragraph, or it can be a highlighted keyword or phrase at the start of a paragraph. As these 4 points make here, it's absolutely vital you show the examiner that you are displaying a list and what that list represents before you start giving the information. For list and describe type questions, name the list item, but add extra value when describing it. Again, I mentioned this earlier. There are marks allocated for naming the list as well as describing. Make sure you do both. Don't waste time providing a context before answering a question. You'll get 0 marks. The examiner knows what the question is about, so don't waste your time and energy writing it down. Just give the number of the question and start answering it immediately. You can use alternate terms or phraseology as long as it is applicable to the question. This is true, for example, when you're naming a project phase, particular tools or process steps or components of modules. Because I've spent many years teaching Prince 2, when it comes to answering a risk question, I would use the terms that Prince 2 uses, but making it clear exactly to the examiner in what sequence and what the purpose of each step is. If a question asks you what the purpose of some aspect is, then what it's seeking is the why within the answer. What is the purpose? Just building on risk as an example here, what is the purpose of carrying out an impact analysis? Then you're saying why you would want to use that. In other words, what value it brings, if you will. When it comes to change control type questions, it's important to focus on the purpose of change control. In other words, why do it, rather than what it just is as a process. In other words, the examiner wants to understand that you haven't just memorized the steps, but you understand why it's valuable as a practicing project manager. Your answer may include elements such as managing scope, costs, stakeholder expectations, risk, opportunity and threats. These are just examples that you may want to build into your answer. The key point here is, like the similar green box here, is when you see the word purpose, it's asking why you're using it. When an advantage or disadvantage is asked for, give a positive or a negative statement depending on what they're asked for, not a statement about what the absence of something may mean. I covered this briefly in the previous slide, so hopefully that's fairly straightforward. Let's look at number 4. Understand the key steps in change control and do not confuse between requirements management and change control. Again, the examiner has found that in some answers, the delegate is confused between change control and requirements management. I make this point in my separate modules on each of these aspects, so do make sure it's clear in your head before moving on. When citing advantages or disadvantages, ensure your answer is unique to matrix management. Now, this piece of feedback comes obviously about an organisational question. And one of the ways your organisation may be set up, and I'm referring to the organisation, not the project, of course, is as matrix management. So when answering a question, when you're describing one of the organisational types and its matrix management, make sure you keep your advantages or disadvantages relevant to matrix management and not one of the others. For example, an organisation that is structured via its departments or groups. Ensure that process steps are at a project level and do not answer a process question down at document level. For example, filling in forms, as these are not key steps. In other words, if you're answering a question on change control, then you talk about the whole process of change control at project level, rather than I would fill out this form, I would pass it to Jim, Jim would then check it, and so on. Those are not the key steps. And don't worry, of course, in the coming modules that you'll study, I've made sure that all key steps are shown at project level. When it comes to team roles, again, this particular topic would include the Belbin approach. Select and explain rather than recall specific role names. When you study this particular aspect, you'll notice there are particular names that Dr. Meredith Belbin has given for particular team roles. If you don't remember those, it's not a big deal as long as you come up with a sensible description that shows that you understand that particular role. A good approach here is to describe the positive and negative attributes of each team role in terms of project, team and outcomes. Rather than simply memorizing team roles, just write briefly what each role's positive attribute is and a sentence on what their negative attributes are. Quality management, a few pointers here. When responding to continuous improvement, respond from a quality perspective and not a project perspective. In other words, talking about processes, tools, techniques and testing, etc. and not citing post-project review lessons and learned. Can you see the point here? Continuous improvement would indeed perhaps have projects holding post-project reviews and taking lessons learned. But if it's a quality question, you need to answer the question in terms of quality processes, quality tools, quality techniques and testing. Requirements management. When naming the steps, a variety of language is acceptable provided it answers the question. Now this won't mean a lot to you until you've covered the requirements management module, but the exam is not a memory test. It's making sure you understand what each of these aspects are. So you may use different terms when describing requirements management. That would be perfectly acceptable and would indeed answer the question. Back to quality management. The examiner would expect to see content which includes using testing outcomes results from quality control and or assurance to take improvement actions, such as feedback to quality assurance, adapting processes, updating quality plans and control points. It really builds on this feedback above here about quality management. Make sure you keep to the topic of quality management and don't drift into general project quality. When it comes to particular tools, as Pareto analysis, Ishikawa and control charts, again within quality, there are blurred lines between quality control and quality assurance. Since back in the real world, many organizations use the terms interchangeably. So please take care to cite these in context if that particular question comes up. Finally, again on quality management, focus on quality as part of the entire project lifecycle and not just down at task level. Again, you'll understand what that means when you cover my modules on quality management.